Thank you, Dan, and thanks, Marie, for organizing this conference. It's great to see people from around the world participating, and thanks for the introduction, Dan. It's very flattering. So, what I'll like to do today is I'll talk about a passage which I do also talk in the book, but after I talked about it in the book, I sort of found a set of other connections that I hadn't realized. So, this is a kind of extension, in a sense, of some of the themes that I was developing in the book. And that passage is a passage that occurs in roughly in the middle of chapter 5. So let me give you the background. It's a strange passage for the following reasons. So in chapter 4 of the Theological Political Treatise, Spinoza provides a definition of the law, and he makes a distinction between human and divine law. Human law is something that is constructed, something that depends on our will, he says, whereas divine law is something absolutely necessary. And after he makes that definition, in an analysis of this point, he says that 4 points follow as a result of that. And he says, I'm going to discuss the first 2 points in chapter 4, and then he turns to the next 2 points in chapter 5. The third point is the point about ceremonies, and here he discusses in particular the ceremonies of the Jewish state. And he says, well, what are we to make about these ceremonies? Are they, divinely ordained, or are they human creations? And he falls very strongly on the latter. He insists that these are human creations, and that's why they're mutable. And that's why he also says that the human ceremonies, the ceremonies of the Jewish state, when the Jewish state is discontinued, they didn't have any real function to play anymore. So he proceeds this argumentation at the beginning of chapter 5, proceeds through references to the Bible to make his point. And then suddenly he stops. He says, at this point, I would like to make the same argument, but from a universal perspective. And at that point, the kind of flow kind of interrupts. There's a kind of different voice in the text. And that different voice in the text kind of provides an incredibly dense account. It's less than two pages in the Gebhardt edition. It's almost 2 pages in the Gebhardt edition. A kind of very short, dense account about social formation. The upshot of which is that social formation is both natural and constructed in ways that I will describe. And it's also a very strange passage because even though this hasn't been noticed, it provides the first kind of intimation of the notion of democracy that we find in Spinoza, by saying that there is a kind of regime of power where everybody renders obedience to themselves. That notion of equality and freedom that characterizes Spinoza's philosophy. Now, this passage, in a sense, kind of sticks out. It doesn't seem to quite fit the argument as it's developing in chapter 5. And I was always wondering, where does he get it from, and what is he trying to do exactly, and why does he sort of make this argument that so the argument there is basically that the ceremonies point to something about the law, and the formation of the ceremonies ultimately point to how society is constructed, how society is formed. And the fact that he points both to natural causes and a kind of constructivist account of society is kind of unusual. That occurs in that sort of short passage of about 2 pages. So I was always very intrigued of that passage, and I was also very intrigued by the fact that it doesn't seem to have been noticed very much at all in the voluminous secondary literature on Spinoza. So that's, the problem, the issue that I'm concerned with. What is this passage about? How are we to understand it? And in particular, what are the sources of this passage? So I'd like to the third part of the paper, I've just finished the first part. The third part will be about the sources of this passage in Hermachus, which is an Epicurean philosopher, and the fourth part will be, an analysis of the passage in Spinoza. But before I go there, I'd like to do a bit of contextualizing about what I mean by Epicureanism and about and who Hermachus is, because he's not a very well-known figure. So there are various accounts of Epicureanism. So part two now. The various accounts of Epicureanism. Epicureanism as naturalism, Epicureanism as hedonism, and so on and so forth. And for a number of reasons, I argue in the book that actually there is a kind of political Epicureanism that also has a kind of ontological basis, and that's the kind of Epicureanism that attracts Spinoza. That's the kind of Epicureanism that we'll find in the theological political treatise. So the sort of starting point, the sort of ontological point of Epicureanism is we need to realize that Epicureanism is a kind of monism. And what I mean by this is the idea that there is no transcendence, there is immanence, but there is no transcendence. It rejects creationism. There is no creation ex nihilo, and it posits the idea that there is a totality outside of which nothing exists. Now, the problem with monism traditionally, and that's the problem behind, for instance, in the 4th century when there's this big debate about evil that someone like Saint Augustine kind of intervenes in with his theory of the free will. But the big problem of monism is how can we account for action? If there is a totality outside of which nothing exists, if there's like comprehensive substance that includes everything, then any action that we undertake is basically inconsequential. It doesn't change anything. And remember, of course, that is the sort of major critique that Spinoza is facing in the first sort of wave of critique that he's facing after the publication of Opera Posthuma. When Bale writes in his entry on Spinozism that when Spinoza writes that 10,000 Germans killed 10,000 Turks, he should actually be writing, what he actually means is that God transformed into the mode of 10,000 Germans kills God transformed to the mode of 10,000 Turks. This is a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the point I was making a moment ago, namely that there is a problem to account for action and change the moment we posit monism as a kind of ontological principle. And that monism as an ontological principle, of course, comes through in chapter 4 with the idea of divine law as absolute necessity. Okay, and it's not accidental, of course, that Spinoza discusses, for instance, the fall, Adam and the fall in chapter 4, which is, the very kind of narrative that Augustine himself discussed to solve in his own way, that I'm not going to go into now, the very same problem. So, what is, briefly speaking, Spinoza's solution to this problem? Spinoza's solution is to say, well, we can understand reality. We can understand reality from, in a sense, two perspectives. One is the causal perspective that will give us a definition of the totality, give definition of cause. Indeed, God is defined in part 1 of the Ethics as the immanent cause, right? But at the same time, in order to talk about action and in order to talk about the possibility of change, we need to talk about utility. The definition in part 4 of the Ethics says the good is that which is utilious. Okay, and then but this is the point that I make in the book, is that this is a very Epicurean way of thinking about the problem of action because of the way in which the concept of phronesis was discussed in Epicureanism. Phronesis in Epicureanism is a concept that I don't know whether you heard, there was a train that was blowing its horn, but anyway, phronesis in Epicureanism is a concept that is geared towards a kind of calculation, calculating the ends of our actions, where the ends are understood as something that arises in the process of acting, and something which is never stable, something which is fallible, something which is contingent, something like that. Okay, so phronesis is also a natural capacity, but because it arises as part of our actions, it's also something that is constructed every time anew. Every time we act, we enact phronesis, a kind of performative, if you want, even though it's a natural capacity. So what I argue in the book is that this notion of phronesis or calculation of utility is absolutely central to Spinoza's project. I kind of link that back to the discussion of phronesis in Epicurus and some passages in Lucretius and so on and so forth. Now, alongside Epicurus and Lucretius, the sort of more famous Epicureans, there was another figure. I mean, there were many significant Epicurean figures. Indeed, it was one of the four major schools of philosophy, and we know that Epicurean philosophers published thousands of books, but only one of them has survived, Lucretius de Rerum Natura, and only a few letters that Epicurus wrote and the principal doctrines have survived from Epicurus's works. But Hermachus is a very interesting figure because Hermachus, or Hermachus, I'm not sure how you pronounce it in English, was actually Epicurus' student, and he succeeded Epicurus as the head of the garden, as the head of the Epicurean school. So we have some information about Epicurus, for instance, in the biographical part of Diogenes Laertius, in the lives of philosophers, and clearly he was a major figure of the Epicurean school, and he wrote many books. And the Refutation of Empedocles is the sort of most famous one in various volumes, nothing of which has survived. Okay, nothing from Hermachus has survived, with the exception of a kind of, we don't even know whether it's a paraphrase or a quotation, but it exists in Porphyry's book De Absentia, or on abstaining from eating meat, which is written, of course, centuries later. Okay. And De Absentia is a book that kind of looks at social and political philosophy to make the argument why it is advisable or good not to eat meat. Okay, and Hermachus, and Porphyry gives an account of how different schools of philosophy deal with that argument, and he turns to Hermachus in order to provide the Epicurean account. So that's the sort of background, the sort of context, to sort of understand the sort of general kind of framework within which I'm sort of looking at that passage in Spinoza in comparison to the passage from Epicurus. Now, what is interesting, so let me talk about the Hermachus passage now, which is, as I said, we do not know whether it's a quotation or a paraphrase, and it's contained in Porphyry's book, De Absentia. The first point to note is very often the argument is made that Epicureanism is apolitical. It doesn't have a politics, and that is mostly based on a comment by Diogenes Laertius. Anyway, that I'm not going to go there, but very often the argument is made. For instance, Leo Strauss, in his book on Spinoza, which is the book that has the most extensive discussion of Epicureanism and Spinoza before the book Spinoza the Epicurean, Leo Strauss argues that Spinoza is an Epicurean, but because Epicureanism lacks a politics, Spinoza's politics actually is a combination of Averroism and Machiavellianism. Okay? So Leo Strauss follows that kind of very common line whereby Epicureanism is understood as apolitical. So it is interesting then that the passage in Porphyry about Hermachus, whether it's a paraphrase or copying would not know, it clearly shows that the Epicurean school has political concerns. In fact, the first point, I'll discuss 3 points. I think there are 3 major points in that passage. The first point is that the Epicurean school has done a genealogy, genealogia. To my knowledge, this is the earliest use of the term genealogy in a philosophical context, right? A genealogy of the laws of different states. So clearly they're interested in political philosophy. A genealogy of the laws of different states, and they have concluded, says Hermachus, or Porphyry paraphrasing Hermachus, they have concluded, he says, that the political is constituted, the systacine is constituted, or is formed because of the calculation of utility, the calculation of to συμφέρον. Okay, and he goes on to sort of indicate that this calculation of utility is both something natural to the human, but also something that it requires that construction or formation that characterizes the kind of enactment of that calculation of utility. Therefore, the laws of all the states that they have reviewed in that genealogy are based on the calculation of utility, and because of that, the laws are both law formation and social formation and political formation is both natural and constructed. It's both a naturalist and a constructed account. I mean, that's not what Porphyry says or Hermachus says. They don't use that terminology because it's not available to them. But the 2 elements, the natural and the constructed element, are clearly present. And then the second point he makes is, and then, the turn of the argument is when he goes, kenin, even now, after the first formation of societies, the sort of same schema, the sort of rational, the natural and the constructed persist. And they persist because, he says, the laws are obeyed because of 2 different reasons. And that is, on the one hand, we obey the laws because it is rational to do so. It is, when we calculate our utility, we calculate that it is to our utility to follow the laws. And, that creates a kind of society of equals, a kind of democratic society. But also, the laws can be followed because of the fear of punishment. Okay, so there is both a kind of rational and a kind of emotional reason whereby we follow the laws, even now. Okay, so that sort of double constitution of society is not simply at the point of origin, but at the point of the preservation of society. And then the third point is there is a kind of dialectic that Hermachus describes between the calculation of utility and or the sort of irrational aspect of how the laws are constructed and obeyed, and the sort of emotional aspect, which kind of tells us, how people might just simply follow the laws and be good citizens and participate in a society. It's a sort of fear of punishment. And he says, if everybody had the capacity to calculate, that is that is actually the key point. Okay, if everybody had the capacity to calculate their utility rationally, properly, to find their true utility, no law would be required. There would be no need for the law to tell us what not to do if conclusive and a proper calculation of utility, that sort of rational function that the Epicureans call phronesis, or the calculation of τους συμφέροντος, of utility. If that was done properly, there would be no requirement for law, and everybody would have been able to live αυθαιρέτως, that is, without an authority imposed upon them, or more simply, freely. But because that is not the case, we require laws, and we require the fear of the law. So there is this kind of conflict between the two. Yeah, rationality as phronesis, as calculation of utility, is great, but it's not enough. You know, it also leads, and it requires the emotional kind of element. And the rest of the political discussion in Hermachus, as it is recorded in Porphyry, is about the interaction between phronesis and emotion, and the sort of emotional kind of disposition. So, to repeat then, Hermachus' argument, as it is presented in Porphyry in just a few pages in Book 1 of the Absentia, has three parts. Okay, takes three steps, so to speak. The first to say that sociality is premised on the calculation of utility, which makes it both natural and constructivist in our terms. The second is, so that's the origin of society. The second is that even now, kenin, any society that preserves itself, has a sort of double basis, in the sense that it both calculates the utility and has a kind of emotional basis. And third, there is a kind of dialectical tension, if you want to call it like that, between the calculation of utility and the emotion, because ideally we can kind of say that it would have been possible to have a society without laws if everybody could calculate their utility correctly, but because it's not possible, we need obedience, we need political authority, and that creates a kind of tension between the two. So that's the account in Hermachus. And then you turn to the passage in Book 5, the sort of second proof about the ceremonies not being part of divine law, but being part of human law. And what is striking, if you compare the two passages, it's striking that these three steps that I described in Hermachus are exactly present in Spinoza too. So the first point that Spinoza makes in that passage is that society is formed for the advantage. The word he uses there, per utilius, so utility in general, all the sort of utility in its cognates in Latin is a translation of to συμφέρον in Greek, which is exactly the word that Hermachus kind of uses. Society is formed for the advantage of the people that are members of the society, and it requires a kind of rational operation, which is kind of natural, and therefore that gives us a sort of basis of the both natural and constructed nature of society, because that calculation of the advantage or the utility is precisely that notion of phronesis that we saw in Hermachus as well. That passage that I have in mind is a sort of passage that kind of reminds us of is kind of reminiscent of Adam Smith. He describes how the society is formed for the advantage of the people, and he justifies it by saying that people cannot do everything on their own. They could not even eat, dress, cut their hair, shave, make merry, or do anything whatsoever, except in accordance with commands and instructions laid down by the law. And this was not all. They had to have certain signs. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong passage. I'm very sorry about that. I should have opened the page beforehand. Forget that. We see that those who live in a barbarous way with no civilizing influences lead a wretched and almost brutish existence, and even so their few and poor and crude resources are not acquired without some degree of mutual help. So there is a kind of rational kind of propensity to provide mutual help so that they share the different resources that they have at their disposal. But that, at the same time, is conducive to constructing a society. So that's the first step in Spinoza. The second step is he provides a distinction between democracy. He doesn't name democracy, but it's the same idea. He says, we can have a state whereby everybody renders obedience to themselves, which is how he defines democracy later. Or he says, if that is not possible, people should be obeying, there should be figures of authority that people should think that are particularly exceptional, and they should attract our obedience. And that obedience is a kind of emotional kind of disposition, whereas when we render obedience to ourselves, it's the sort of through the calculation of our utility. So we see exactly that same distinction between even now, during the phase of the preservation of society, who have on the one hand the operation of phronesis, and on the other the sort of emotional disposition that has to do with obedience. And the third element in Spinoza is that Spinoza also says explicitly that if people calculate their true utility, then laws will strictly not be necessary. But that's not the case, because we know the better but do the worse, and because we go astray in our calculations, we're forced to have laws that need to be obeyed and an authority that regulates these laws. So, the third point that Hermachus made, the possibility of a lawless society based on phronesis, because everybody can calculate the utility properly, which is actually simply a fantasy. And, you need the sort of obedience as a kind of dialectical counterpoint to create the tension between phronesis and emotion, so that we can give an account of society. So we see exactly the three same steps about social formation in Hermachus and Spinoza. And we see also that these three steps provide an account of society that is understood both in naturalist and constructivist terms. It is not the sort of rational animal, pure rational animal of Aristotle's politics, nor is it the artificial animal that Hobbes is talking about in the Leviathan. It is a bit of both, or is a combination of both. There is a difference at the end of the passage in chapter 5 and Hermachus. The difference is that Spinoza kind of indicates the tensions that exist, highlights the tensions that exist as a relation of the dialectic between phronesis and the calculation of utility and the emotions and the demand to obey. And there is a kind of potential for social conflict and political conflict there, and that element is absent in Hermachus. But apart from that, the similarity between these passages is quite astonishing. So maybe I can leave it there. I mean, I can summarize very quickly what I said. I mean, there's this strange passage.
Yeah, if you could summarize in the next minute or so, that would be perfect.
Yeah. I just want to sort of go very, very quickly through what I said. I forgot to check the time when I started, so I don't know how long I've been talking.
You know, if you could finish in the next minute, that would be great. But it's been awesome otherwise.
Okay, so there's a strange passage in chapter 5 that explicitly addresses social formation, and it's very dense and obscure. Where does he get it from? Well, you know, if you compare that passage with the passage about social formation, the only passage about explicitly about social formation that we find in the Epicurean tradition, with an exception that I'm happy to talk about in question time, and that is the passage from of Hermachus in Porphyry's De Absentia. They have exactly the three same moves. The two texts kind of mirror each other. So I just found that very intriguing, and it's also really important that if we realize that kind of influence or that kind of confluence, then it becomes clear that Spinoza's position is neither a naturalist nor a constructivist, but a combination of the two. Thank you.